isolated and alone.
Isolated and struggling.
Increasingly isolated.
Russia is more isolated on the world stage than ever.
Hello, Gold Silver family. Alan Hibbert here with another video, and today I wanted to give you a highlight on the BRICS Summit that happened last week in Russia. There's a lot to talk about, and I want to break this video into three parts. First, I want to show you the size and strength of the BRICS Union. Second, I want to show you the economic developments that are happening therein. And third, I want to talk about the military developments that are happening as a result of these forming bonds. So let's get into it. First of all, to summarize, China says the BRICS Summit in Russia was a complete success. And this is kind of the theme, is all of these countries getting along very well and they're stronger than ever. The South African president says the BRICS Summit in Russia is the most successful BRICS Summit in history. That's pretty strong endorsement. Most successful in history. Indian Prime Minister Modi says India is becoming a hub for global trade. That's a pretty big deal, becoming a hub for global trade. Russia is experiencing its, quote, fastest economic growth in the last decade. That's pretty impressive, especially because Russia has been sanctioned by the West pretty heavily lately. Speaking of, US and NATO sanctions on Russia have failed, Western media admits. Sanctions have not been able to curb the flow of cash from the Kremlin's most valuable asset, oil. Russia is the third largest producer in the world, and this year its oil and gas revenues are expected to increase by 2.6%, reaching nearly $240 billion. Despite all the sanctions, the Kremlin is still making so much money from its oil. Now, there's a video here from 60 Minutes. It's almost 4 minutes long. It's a great video. This guy basically summarizes how Russia is able to sell its oil anyways, despite sanctions. Effectively, it's sort of disguising the ships that's carrying the oil and transporting them, changing ships like in midstream, mid-ocean, and selling a lot of it to India. And then India is supplying other parts of the world. So interesting video. And speaking of, India passes Saudi Arabia as Europe's top fuel supplier. So exactly because of that. So Russia's oil is sanctioned. So Russia is selling it to India. And then India is selling it to the rest of the world. So India is just a middleman. They're making out great, and Russia doesn't seem to be hurt by it. So it's almost like India is money laundering, but it's like oil laundering. So at least that's how it appears to me. Maybe there's more to the story, but just when we look at the headlines, that's what's happening. President Putin says Russia-China relations are at their highest level in history. Highest level in history. That's pretty significant because Russia and China have long histories. So things seem to be going well from their perspective. Just in, leaders from 36 countries posed together for a picture during a BRICS summit. So there's a lot of countries here. I'm not going to read them all. You can pause it if you want to read through this list. Here's the bottom half. And I can't help but think that as a photographer, like imagine you're the one taking this photo. You get everyone lined up. You're like, okay, a serious one. And then, okay, now a silly one. Like, I would love to see that. Sadly, I don't think they did that. But you can see here that 36 countries, they're getting along just fine. So that's really the size of BRICS. And what I should point out is that BRICS officially adds 13 new nations to the alliance as partner countries, not full members. So not all 36 of those were full members. In fact, they didn't add any full members at the summit here, but they did add 13 nations as partner countries. And two that I want to highlight here are Cuba and Turkey. We're going to talk about those each in just a second, but they are partner countries here. But first, Russia is isolated. So this video popped up. Basically, we see Western leaders and Western media claiming over and over that, quote, Russia is isolated. And they've been pushing this phrase using the same language. Russia is isolated for 2 years. It's almost like wishful thinking or trying to like brainwash people because it doesn't really seem like Russia is isolated. Watch this video.
Putin is now isolated from the world more than ever.
Russia has never been so isolated. We have never been more united.
We have demonstrated that Russia is isolated and alone.
Russia is globally isolated.
It shows the degree to which Mr. Putin and Russia are increasingly isolated.
President Putin has never been more isolated.
Isolated and alone.
Isolated and struggling.
increasingly isolated.
Russia is more isolated on the world stage than ever.
Okay, Russia is isolated. I don't know about that. But speaking of isolation, I also saw this tweet here. The United Nations General Assembly votes overwhelmingly to condemn the United States economic embargo on Cuba. Okay, so this is not from the BRICS Summit, right? This is the United Nations General Assembly. So it's definitely different. However, just on that theme of isolated, who's isolated, who's not, who's well connected, who's forming bonds, okay? The vote in the 193 member world body was 187-2. Okay, with only the United States and Israel voting against the resolution. So the United States and Israel together, isolated from the rest of the world. So even though we have these Western leaders claiming that Russia is isolated, it doesn't seem that way. It really doesn't seem that way. So bit of a contrast there. Make of that what you will. Moving right along, Russian President Putin says the BRICS Summit demonstrates that a new world order is emerging. What is that new world order? Okay, so now we get into two other pieces. I want to talk about the economic piece and then the military piece. So, BRICS grain exchange may become full-fledged commodity exchange in the future. So, Putin announced a grain exchange basically so that the BRICS countries can trade food with each other. A number of BRICS members countries are among the world's largest producers of grain, legumes, and oilseeds. The creation of a grain exchange will help form fair and predictable price indicators for food products and raw materials in light of measures to ensure food security, Putin said. Putting this initiative into practice will help protect national markets from negative external intervention, speculation, and attempts to cause an artificial shortage of foodstuffs. So this is, Russia and friends basically creating their own system where they can ensure food security for themselves, and that could become a full-fledged commodity exchange in the future. So they're really laying the groundwork for their own exchange, independent of the West, independent of the dollar, independent of Western sanctions. So, speaking of the dollar, Russian President Putin says BRICS is not creating any financial alternatives to SWIFT, but is instead using national currencies for international trade settlements. So currently using sovereign currencies, national currencies to settle their trade. They're trying not to use the dollar, but they're also not creating a separate payment system, which is very interesting. That may change in the future, or perhaps their currencies might be backed by gold or some other commodity or basket of commodities. That's all speculation for right now. But Putin says he's not creating an alternative to SWIFT. However, 85% of trade is settled in local currencies, not the US dollar. And this is a bit misleading here. This isn't in BRICS as a whole. This is in just a subset, basically between Russia and like a dozen countries nearby, but not exactly the BRICS countries, not just yet, at least not that 85% number. However, it could become that in the near future, in the next year or two. And just to give you a size of, just to give you a sense of the size of the economies involved, we can look at the GDP of the BRICS countries versus the G7, for example. The BRICS countries, 35% of GDP, G7 countries, only 29%. So the BRICS countries have a larger combined GDP than the G7 countries. Okay, so this is significant. If we put that in dollar figures, we're talking about 65 trillion versus 55 trillion. And in terms of growth forecasts, how is this going to change over time? The BRICS are expected to grow at 3.6% annually instead of 1%. Now, these are just forecasts. Obviously, these numbers could be wrong, but even if they're wrong by a lot, that still implies that the BRICS are probably going to grow faster than the G7 countries. So this is a major, major trend, and it's already swinging in favor of the BRICS countries. Chinese President Xi Jinping calls on BRICS to defend peace and achieve common security around the world. So now we talk about the military piece, and it's interesting when you defend peace. We know anyone who's been exposed to George Orwell knows that peacekeeping forces, they hold guns, right? The way you keep the peace is by threatening violence. Hopefully it doesn't escalate there, but that's kind of how it's done. So let's talk about what's going on. The Turkish president, Erdogan, says the United States uses terrorist organizations in the region for its own interests and for the security of Israel. Terrorist organizations. Okay, bold claim. And by the way, we mentioned a minute ago that Turkey is now a partner country with BRICS, not a full member, but a partner country. And Turkey is a NATO country. So Turkey's sort of playing both sides here, saying that the United States uses terrorist organizations to accomplish its objectives. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but that's what's being said. Iran says any American base used to refuel and support an Israeli attack will be a legitimate target for Iranian retaliatory strikes. That seems like a clear warning to me. I guess I will leave that without further comment. Iran says the United States government is complicit in Israeli aggression and will bear its consequences. That was a few days ago. And then earlier today, Iran's supreme leader calls to create a global military coalition to go against Israel. A global military coalition to go against Israel. Israel's pretty small. A global military coalition, that seems large. So Confucius say, don't use a cannon to kill a mosquito. So that to me seems like overdoing it, unless you're not just talking about Israel, you're also talking about its ally, the United States. That's my interpretation. So global military coalition, that's large, doesn't get bigger than that. Former Prime Minister of Israel says Hezbollah and Hamas are not our enemies. The extremists of Israel and Netanyahu are. Interesting plot twist. Very interesting plot twist. Russian President Putin warns failure to recognize a state of Palestine will fuel permanent crisis and inevitable large-scale violence. Okay. Recognize the state of Palestine. Okay. So if you want to avoid large-scale violence, there's one thing you got to do, according to Putin. Also Putin at the BRICS Summit. So we're switching to the Ukraine war now. It wasn't the actions of Russia that led to the escalation in Ukraine. It was the coup in Ukraine in 2014 that was supported by the United States. So there's a video here. Obviously, Putin speaks in Russian, but there's an English translator. And this video is a minute long. I'd encourage you guys to watch it. Basically, Putin is explaining his version of events going back 10 years, saying that, look, it wasn't Russia that escalated the tensions. It was effectively the United States supporting a coup in Ukraine and then lying about it and then admitting to having lied about it. In the meantime, arming the Ukrainian forces and encouraging violence of their own. So that's Putin's side of the story. I don't know what the truth is, of course, but I think it's important to understand how each of the major players view the stage, right? And how they think that events unfolded. North Korea deploys 10,000 soldiers to fight alongside Russia in its war with Ukraine, Pentagon confirms. Okay. Meanwhile, the G7 nations are going to send Ukraine $50 billion from frozen Russian assets. So sanctioning Russia, freezing its assets, and then giving those assets to Ukraine. Okay. Seems like more escalations. Really, just everywhere we look, it's escalations. Just in, President Putin orders the military to begin nuclear weapons drills. Okay, so again, another video here. It's about a minute and a half, and Putin is describing that he's ordering his military to be prepped for nuclear weapons drills. and he views the use of nuclear weapons as like an extreme measure that he doesn't take lightly, but he wants to be prepared because he doesn't know what the other players will do. And finally, a tweet from about an hour ago. European Union warns its citizens to stockpile food and supplies in case of war with Russia. As part of this strategy, the EU should advise households to be prepared to be self-sufficient for a minimum of 72 hours in the event of an emergency. 72 hours does not seem like a very long time, in my opinion. I mean, this is like if you're worried about nuclear war, you don't hide under the desk. I mean, that's not really going to do anything. It might make you feel better ahead of time, but it's not going to do anything when the emergency occurs. So if this is a serious concern, I would extend this timeline significantly. So anyways, that's all I got. Those are the developments from BRICS. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and pray for peace. Thanks, guys. See you soon.